Hello and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kutub.
Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. What makes a city livable? Recurring flash floods and worsening traffic congestion in the Greater Klang Valley area have had many wondering about the livability of our cities. Are these concerns legitimate? Well, let's ask our first guest tonight, Lilian Tay. She's the design principal at Veritas Architects. She's also the immediate past president of the Malaysian Institute of Architects, which is the professional body for architects in the country. Lilian, how would you describe a city that is livable? Does KL or the cities in the Greater Klang Valley area like Petaling Jaya, Subanjaya, Shah Alam, do these cities meet those criteria?
Well, I believe, morning Lisa and Sharad, I do believe that the quality of life in our cities are good by global standards. I would first say that. But certainly there are areas which can be improved quite a bit. And through my years working as an architect and seeing and living in Kuala Lumpur and Petaling Jaya in the suburbs, I can see some of the quite large structural problems that need to be addressed at the planning level and also at the more micro level of design.
Lilian, do you think, just for sort of give us a kind of conceptual clarity, the idea of livability and quality of life is a kind of, an equivalent, I guess, expression for that. This idea emerges at some point, right, historically, and indexes also appear, and the media loves to kind of, headline these indexes, and Malaysia never is in the top 10, and there are a few Asian cities that are. How important is livability? Why has livability become a marker of the success of a city?
Well, I think a lot of livability is to do with how your everyday life is in the city, how it is, or in the town where you live. How you get to work, how you get your kids to school, and to be able to come back in time, not be stuck in unproductive traffic jams. So these are some of the sort of more physical dimensions of how you would gauge livability. And then I think there's also the more sort of, that there is also a need for people to have an attachment and a sense of belonging to the place, that you love your city. You love your city because of many things, because of the sense of community, because of the sense of history that you see when you're walking its streets. So there is the sort of less sort of quantitative aspect as well, which I think these qualitative aspects are quite equally important. I do believe Kuala Lumpur has no lack of infrastructure. Over the last 20, 30 years, since the early 90s, we've put in a lot of investment in infrastructure. We've got some of the best highways in the world, really. We are very connected in terms, nationally. But perhaps I think the way we have put down roads in our towns and cities are now starting to be questioned because they are fragmenting neighborhoods. When we build an efficient highway, whatever, plus and whatnot, so that they give all these wonderful names, Link and Speed and Duke, and they actually have the way engineers drive through. I think we need more consideration for existing neighborhoods, how you don't fragment neighborhoods, and people can't therefore they can't walk to the places they used to walk because there's a lot of infrastructure obstructions that have come into residential neighborhoods over time, making it therefore quite hard to walk. So people become more and more reliant on cars, and then therefore we have all this congestion, and not only that, the larger issues of climate change. How the high levels of carbon emission that we impose from our daily lives living in the city.
Does that just boil down to planning then, Lillian? Is it just all about urban planning and how you lay down your streets and where you build your infrastructure?
Well, I think they all need to come together. They need to be more integrated. Often as architects, we go in and, the engineering is already there, for instance. The engineering drives a lot of things, and I think engineering needs to be more sensitive, for instance. Like, for instance, when we're building, for instance, the LRT, MRT, there's all the statistics that inform you where the train should run. But then after that, issues of the availability of space. But I think we need to have a very long-term criteria and views of not just putting the most economical way, for instance, to put down all these necessary infrastructure to make our enlarging city more connected, but also to think about what it does to the immediate locality. Does it fragment it? Because it's a great obstruction, an elevated road, for instance. And I think I can perhaps give an example. For instance, the LRT is mostly elevated around KL, but there's one part where the line is underground, which is along Jalan Ampang. And you can now see, 20 years later, how prosperous is Jalan Ampang, how, the walking is so much better there, just because you don't have those physical obstruction. Buildings are more connected and it becomes very walkable. And the whole Jalan Ampang KLCC area is very walkable. Contrasted to, for instance, Sultan Ismail, which has this, train slicing through the avenue, and people can't cross the streets. Retail doesn't prosper because there's no visibility, there are no pedestrians walking. So I do believe we have underestimated how the engineering aspect can pose long-term obstructions, to the quality of being in the city, living in the city, walking in the city, and these are some aspects I believe that we need to look at. Of course, there's a lot of issues about affordability of housing and all that, and probably we'll go into that as well.
So Lillian, one of the things, bring up affordability and, maybe mistakes made in the past, and we see examples, around perhaps, in more developed countries where mistakes are corrected. So, something quite major like covering up a river, and with a road, and that is corrected.
Yes.
Can we in Malaysia afford to correct the mistakes of the past? And what cost do we pay in the long term if we don't correct those mistakes?
As I mentioned, I think our neighborhoods in the city, our ever enlarging neighborhoods, gets more and more fragmented. Many cities have done what you just mentioned, was done in Seoul when they removed a highway from the 70s. And then created a public park to the city on the footprint of the highway. The river had always been there. They actually built over the river, and we have very similar issues where we have built over what could potentially be the core green amenities of the city. And I think even in cities like New York and Chicago, for instance, they built the elevated L, the elevated trains way back in the 20s, and they took it down. They took it down because they realized that it was an obstruction to the neighborhood. For instance, New York also then created the High Line, which is also on an elevated rail. They took away the train and created a park on where the train used to be. So it's just that, coming from a developing city country, of course, we want to lay down the infrastructure, but I think we're beginning to see that there are some long-term impact of this infrastructure that needs to be considered, as the cities grow.
Lillian, you mentioned fragmented cities, fragmented neighborhoods a couple of times, and I'm just wondering, why is it bad to fragment neighborhoods and cities?
Because they can't walk. It makes it difficult to walk. I think one of our biggest problems is obviously congestion. And they're everyone is heavily reliant on cars, whether you're living in Subang Jaya or Shah Alam, coming into the city, or even just coming from Bangsa, for instance, to the city center, you would be facing congestion. and it's if you could if the planning of the city was of the infrastructure was such that it wasn't so driven by vehicular transport, the city would be more walkable because some of these highways really just cut through neighborhoods where you simply can't walk. I know in many places, even where in Ampang, I think the UK Heights area, there used to be connectivity across the roads. And once the highway is there, you can't walk to where you would normally walk across the other side to get to your shops. Even
Lillian, sorry, we're running out of time, and I completely understand this because I'm a pedestrian. I don't drive, and therefore I feel the pain of fragmented neighborhoods and spaces obstructed by these perhaps very useful but ultimately problematic infrastructure. I do want to ask you though, in long term, because we see many headlines in terms of deforestation that's driven by the suburban sprawl, is there a need for government to rethink this? Pull everything back, create denser cities with better infrastructure, more livability, and discourage the encroachment of our cities into forests.
Exactly. I believe some density, you mentioned density, and that is one thing. I think if we really want public transportation to work, and get people out, away from always constantly relying on driving their cars and getting them on the train, because we've got all the train infrastructure that we need. There's an aversion generally to density. They always think density is bad, but actually density does enable a more sort of a less vehicular dependent urban life. That's for sure. And I say it's because the stations are actually planned quite well. They're always that distance, walkable distance apart. But in between, would you want to walk? If we actually study the stations, even though in a radius of 400 meters, you think that it's walkable, but there will be lots of other highway infrastructure, infrastructure that would make it less walkable.
Right. Lillian, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. We really appreciate your insights. Lillian Tay, Design Principal at Veritas Architects there. We're going to take a quick break here and consider this. We will be back with more. Stay tuned. Hi, thanks so much for staying with Strad and I on Consider This. We're discussing the livability of our cities in the Greater Klang Valley area. This after many city dwellers are grappling with recurring flash floods and worsening traffic congestion. Joining us now is Dr. Soraya Ismail. She's Director of Research at Khazanah Research Institute. Dr. Soraya, how would you respond to those who say that KL isn't a livable city?
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you for having me on board. I think their concerns are valid. I think the way in which our personal discomfort of how we move in the city, how we live in the city, manifests itself into the collective of discomfort. And therefore, when people are angry or having displeasure of even walking in the city, being in their cars, being stranded when there's a flash flood, these all create a sense of understanding and consensus that it is real, that the city is not livable to the most, to 99% of its inhabitants.
Yeah, so is there a solution, Soraya? What would it take? Is it going to have to be driven by the private sector? Or is it the state and the public sector that really needs to rethink its assumptions when it comes to, as you pointed out, issues of mobility and sort of work-life balance and time you might spend traveling and so on and so forth?
It's an excellent question. So, in any planning of a city, it is not basic. What we're experiencing now is a snapshot of what has happened throughout the years. And throughout the years, the balancing act between the needs of the private sector, the needs of the state, and the needs of household might not be in unison, and yet so conceptually might not be in unison, and who gets the priority in city planning. So that's one issue. Whenever, for example, I am very reluctant to agree with a very high density of people in one neighborhood, because sometimes it spoils the neighborhood environment, but some might say it will create more vibrancy, but to a certain extent, when it's too high, it will bear its consequences on the public infrastructure that wasn't designed for such high density. So this creates the clogs in a infrastructure of a city. Now, secondly, when things do happen this way, Charat, city folk must give input to the people in power, the state or local council, to let them know that we don't want this density. We don't want this type of congested cities in our public spaces, in our cities. However, I would also want to say something about people, because when we were younger, 20 years ago, public spaces had, for example, a swimming pool is a public swimming pool and it needed less space. In the 1980s and 1990s, we started having this type of development whereby privatized public spaces are in the complex of housing. And therefore, these are privatized public spaces that then creates more spaces are needed for each development. And therefore, net, the types of amenities are duplicated but not accessible to all. And in that sense, it also creates the congestion. Now, the third one is the contested space. A lot of people would say that we need more shopping complexes because it creates vibrancy in our cities. And I sometimes think that a city also is a reflection of the people in that place. We have less public spaces. Is it because of, only 10% of society want public spaces which is accessible to all, but 90% wants shopping malls? And as you know, when we actually build so much built form and it's not following certain public infrastructure types of efficiency, we have created our own destiny of clogging, making it not sustainable, and as well as making sure that making it even worse for those who reside in the city, because we wanted this vibrancy and density in that way. I think, Sharat, everybody's got to be blamed in this.
When you pose that question of who gets priority in city planning and who is prioritized in city planning, I would have thought the answer would be the citizen, but that's not necessarily the case, is it? There are competing interests when we think about city planning. Who often wins, Soraya?
Citizens don't own land. It's the commercial sector that owns land. So what they want on their piece of land is something that they will normally, of course, it's property rights. And what the structure plan, the planning people from JPPD Plan Malaysia, would then say, but this plot might disrupt other plots, and therefore you might have, maybe to reduce your density, might not be such a good thing for the area. But I ask you this, Melissa, if you just have that one plot that you want to make your return on investment, you want to go sky high for profit. You wouldn't want to think about, I want to increase walkability, I want to make sure everybody's happy. Because if cities are planned for a real estate type of objective, we will never have a livable city.
Yes, right. Can I ask you about the other kind of like silent stakeholder in this conversation? You mentioned the private sector, capital, you mentioned the state, you mentioned citizens, but there's also the environment. And in the 21st century, shouldn't we consider the impact of our cities, not just on the citizens, the denizens of the city, but also on the larger environment? And urban sprawl, I know you're against density, but density is a solution in some ways to the endless sprawl of cities and suburbs that are destroying forests?
Well, it depends. Say, for example, okay, let's go back to density. Now, density, if it's too high, it will be too expensive to maintain your building. So let's go back. So let's go to the inhabitants that will stay in stratified buildings. To a certain extent, even when you have finished paying for your house loan mortgage, you will still need to pay for the maintenance of stratified building. And the higher density it is, the more expensive it is. So one of the things that could create urban slums in stratified buildings, especially in low cost and medium cost apartments, are the high density of these places. If we're putting people in poverty or people in low income strata in these places. So that kind of go against the reason why we want to have high density to begin with. So, but again, Sharat, this is a complex issue. So what we want is a design that is sustainable for the financial feasibility of poor household, as well as it doesn't take away the issues on environmentally sustainability. In some countries where you want to ensure that all stratified buildings have maybe 17 floors, not more than 18 floors. Now, this is when the sprawl might happen, but with proper infrastructure that aligns the public infrastructure that aligns the ecosystem or the habitat of the household. This will create less traffic because you actually plan for satellite or nuclear cities or neighborhoods along that greater KL or greater Klang Valley, they call it.
Okay, yeah. Soraya, can I ask you? I mean, when what you're describing, it's long term. City planning, urban planning is long term. We're feeling the consequences, the effects of decisions made years ago. Are there quick fixes to perhaps mitigate some of the discomforts we're feeling today as denizens of the city? I mean, is there a way to kind of reverse some of the negative consequences?
I think it takes every one of us to claim back our city. It takes every one of us. Some of us, I mean, for example, I have issues with Jalan Raya, Jalan Raya that have no shoulder, but bahu jalan. Because whenever, see this is very easy. This is a quick fix. So you have a long queue, and then there is an accident on the public highways. Going from PJ or Taman Tun, I live that side, all the way to KL. But all the roads leading to KL have no shoulders. So if there is you drive nanti you tengok. And you're paying toll for it, sorry. And if you ada kereta rosak or basically ada accident, you can't push the cars to the side, and it creates a backlog to the back. So this is one easy thing to do, which is make sure all our roads have road shoulders. This is normal practice in all countries, all cities. We don't have it.
Okay,
so something as simple as that.
Yeah, so the question is, you say it's there in all cities and we don't have it. Why is it that we don't have what is kind of commonplace in other cities? Who has dropped the ball on city planning, on urban planning?
Wow. So who? So I'll answer that question with another question. Who endorses all these concessions for roads? But basically, that's the funding. But I'm going to get so much into trouble with my professional bodies. But who The professionals build architect, civil engineer, but for roads is civil engineers. They build roads. Maybe we don't want to build a shoulder road. I don't know why they don't want to build it, but this is on the I think it lands on civil engineers and the professionals that's inside these projects.
Right.
I think the professionals should take ownership of all this.
Dr. Suraya, we appreciate your candor with us today. Appreciate your time and insights. Dr. Suraya Ismail from Khazanah Research Institute. They're wrapping up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching, and a good night.